Those who ascribe to the great powers view of history may interpret the Russia-Ukraine war as a clash of political cultures, part of a wider geopolitical game. They may go so far as to suggest that such a civilisational conflict was inevitable, but this interpretation ignores the agency of individuals, groups, and nations in making decisions, and in some way absolves them of the guilt for the crimes that are being committed on an unimaginable scale against real individuals. This macro-political interpretation also skirts over the illegality and corruption at the heart of Putin's system of governance, the vertical power structure, rampant nepotism, the lack of checks and balances, rule of law, and an independent judiciary, which are just as important in explaining how we got to this dangerous tipping point in history. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. Our materials are now being made available on popular podcasting platforms as well, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Today, I'm joined with Maria Popova, who is the Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal. She holds a BA in Spanish Literature and Government from Dartmouth College and a PhD in Government from Harvard University. She has lived and conducted research across Eastern Europe and Eurasia and its various regime incarnations, from growing up in the Balkans before 1989, through interviewing judges and lawyers in Russia and Ukraine for her dissertation research in the 2000s, to her current attempt to disentangle real from fake anti-corruption efforts in Bulgaria, Romania, and Ukraine. This, of course, is the ideal background to explore the road to war that Putin has taken. So welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me.
And I have to start off with probably an impossible question, but the big question about this so-called inevitability of war. I mean, do you think this is inevitable? And if it wasn't inevitable, then who is culpable really for the crisis?
It's a really good question. And I wouldn't say that anything is inevitable. Inevitable, I feel, is a really strong way of putting it. But I would argue that this war became increasingly likely over the last 30 years, and especially quite likely since 2014, when Russia first crossed this line into military aggression against Ukraine and more or less got away with it. So 2014 really hastened things. But I would say that the root of this war is really the way in which the Soviet Union collapsed. You have in 1991 we had this idea that the Soviet Union just disbanded, and Russia willingly let go of all of its colonies within the Soviet Union, and that was the end of it. However, now that we look back on the way in which the Soviet Union disintegrated in '91, we see that there was a significant difference in how Russia viewed the disintegration and how the other Soviet republics viewed the disintegration. The Ukrainian leader at the time, who signed the Belovezha Accords disintegrating the Soviet Union, Leonid Kravchuk, said that he perceived this as a civilized divorce, the end of the relationship between the different Soviet republics. However, it seems that Russia and Yeltsin saw this not so much as a divorce, but as a rewriting of the vows in the form of the Commonwealth of Independent States. So there was an expectation in Russia that they will continue kind of setting the tone for the region. They would continue having a lot of influence over the former Soviet republics. And this misunderstanding in the beginning of the 90s really sets the tone for the development of the relationships between the former Soviet republics and Russia over time. And what we see in these 30 years is Ukraine growing increasingly attached to its independence and gradually figuring out that the direction that it wants to take is a pro-European and increasingly democratic direction. Whereas we know, of course, that Russia went from an attempt to build a democracy in the early 90s that sort of quickly failed and has been on an autocratization course for the last 20 years. So this clash over time accentuates and becomes more and more pronounced. And we see that the more Russia wanted to shorten this distance between itself and Ukraine, the more Ukraine wanted to pull away. And the more Ukraine wanted to pull away, the more Russia escalated the methods with which it wanted to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence. So what we see is that after 2014, things come to a head, really, and Russia sees that it is possible to take parts of Ukraine and reintegrate them, so to speak, this way, and we have by this year Putin calculating that maybe he could take all of Ukraine and it would be easy and quick, and the international community will ultimately accept it. And this was really the huge miscalculation that he made, which we all know about.
And of course, some people, as I said in the introduction, view this as an inevitable clash between civilizations, between great powers, and so on. But that is to impose a very sort of win-lose scenario, isn't it? It's to discount the idea that there could have been some kind of cooperation, some middle ground, or a win-win scenario. And it wasn't inevitable, really, was it, that Ukraine would pull so far away from that relationship with Russia? And in fact, at the start, they didn't seek to completely divorce. That's happened over time as perhaps Russia's unreasonable behavior has pushed them away.
Right. So I think what the great power geopolitical lens misses here is the role of domestic politics, both in Russia and in Ukraine, that is really, I think, the driver of this process, much more so than some kind of sphere of influence. And the domestic process on the Ukrainian side is a process in which Ukraine gradually developed a democratic regime. That was not a given. It might not have happened. It could have failed several times over the course of the last 30 years. Imagine, let's say that in 2004, during the Orange Revolution, imagine that revolution failed and Yanukovych became president right then and there and started a process of autocratization and became another Putin or another Lukashenko, then I think it would have been much easier for an authoritarian Ukraine to find a common ground with an authoritarian Russia, and things may have been sort of a clash may have been avoided that way. However, over time, Ukraine did develop into a democratic state, not because of any great power politics, but because of domestic reasons, because its civil society grew stronger. The competition between different constituencies within Ukraine sort of consolidated political competition to a point where Ukrainian citizens started taking for granted that a Ukrainian president cannot become an authoritarian leader, will lose if they tried to consolidate an authoritarian regime. So over time, as Ukraine democratizes, it also becomes harder for Russia to keep it in its sphere of influence, to keep it not only geopolitically within its sphere of influence, but to keep it compliant with what Russia saw as important to its own domestic politics. So, in other words, Russia interfered in Ukrainian domestic affairs, not just about Ukraine's foreign policy course. It interfered and expressed strong opinions and pushed on all sorts of issues, language policies, economic policies that the country is going to pursue, historical memory policies. And the more Russia interfered, the more Ukraine pulled away because it saw this interference as unacceptable, given its own domestic pressures to come up with a policy that was acceptable to all parts of Ukrainian society. So what we see is that over time, as Russia becomes less and less able to influence Ukrainian domestic policies, its methods that it uses start escalating. They go from using diplomatic pressure, using economic pressure through energy blackmail, threatening border disputes, as happened, for example, in 2003 with the Tuzla island incident. All of these methods escalate over time, and they come to a head in 2014 when, in response to a largely domestic Ukrainian affair, something that Russia should not have had a particular, I mean, sure, it could have had an opinion about which president it wanted to rule Ukraine, but certainly had no business interfering militarily to determine the outcome of a domestic Ukrainian affair. We have in 2014 outright aggression, military aggression by Russia in order to try to change Ukraine's course. And that was a major miscalculation too, because of course, by taking Crimea from Ukraine, by opening up a front in Donbass and removing part of Donbass from Ukrainian control, Russia removed the most pro-Russian parts of Ukraine. That single-handedly shifted sort of the median voter in Ukraine towards a more Ukrainian position that Russia liked even less. So in a way, 2014 was a very serious miscalculation. The Russians basically shot themselves in the foot with this decision. So that really escalates this dynamic of the two countries being on very divergent trajectories.
And of course, in 2022, that is another massive miscalculation, isn't it? Their belief that they had enough paid agents, they had enough corrupt bought politicians in the administration, the army, local councils and so on, and the probably incorrect intelligence they were getting, and their complete lack of understanding about Ukrainian identity, and the very reaction they brought about since 2014. They just completely ignored the fact that they had pushed that society away, and to some extent, I don't want to use the word sort of radicalized there, because that makes it sound like extreme nationalism a factor, and I don't happen to believe it is at all. But certainly they pushed Ukraine closer to the West, and they pushed Ukrainians to look deeper into their history, I think, didn't they? And tried to rediscover an alternative identity from the one that Russian propaganda or historical myths tended to expound.
Absolutely. I mean, 2022 was a huge miscalculation for many reasons. I mean, partly because the Putin regime is at this point such a personalistic dictatorship that it was very difficult to have honest intelligence brought to the top. honest intelligence, which is going to contradict the assumptions held at the top. That's one reason. But also, I think a major reason of this miscalculation was sort of the narrative that developed within Russia, that all the pro-democracy movements in the former Soviet space were not driven by local actors, but were engineered by the West. The color revolutions as US-backed movements was such a strong narrative that it seems the Russian elites believed themselves. And the thing is that if you believe this narrative that Euromaidan in 2013-14 was not Ukrainians organizing through civil society to protest, and eventually, because the regime used force to really stand up against an authoritarian leaning regime and the collapse of this regime under enormous domestic pressure. If you don't see Euromaidan this way, but you see it as some sort of conspiracy by the US, where the Ukrainians are just puppets in this conspiracy and they were driven by the US, then it is much easier to think that all you need to do, remove the puppeteers at the top, and the Ukrainian population will accept, will see the light, will accept your leadership, or would even think that they're being liberated by Russia from these US overlords. So the fact that they were not greeted by liberators, in fact, that Ukrainian society kind of stood up as one to try to defend their country from this invasion, is very much a evidence that this narrative about the US-backed coup was really a weak and superficial conspiracy with no backing in reality. That it was, in fact, very much that Ukrainian society saw this interference and push by Russia as unacceptable, and it moved towards an understanding over the years that maybe it will not be easy to have sort of a balanced relationship where Ukraine is in the middle and between Russia and Europe, and kind of on good terms with both. Increasingly, Ukrainian society saw that for Russia, this is not an acceptable situation. What Russia wants is Ukraine squarely subservient to Russia, a vassal state, if you will. And if you're not okay with this, your only option then is to go full on into the European direction, because the middle is just not an option. And it took some years for Ukrainian society to come to this realization. I think the historic, the entangling of histories between Russia and Ukraine is the reason why Ukrainian society didn't immediately see that that's the situation they're in. But over time, Russia made it increasingly clear that Ukraine will have to choose a side. And if it chooses the Russia side, it chooses to basically give up its sovereignty and independence and become a vassal state. And if it wants to continue building on a democratic regime and an independent one, it will need to go in the European direction. And in 2022, we see a moment in which Ukrainian society is now fully united behind this goal. Sort of upwards of 85-95% of Ukrainian society has chosen that goal.
And I've spoken now to sort of dozens of Ukrainians, many of whom were involved in Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity, and they've described the chaos and the complexity of those protests. The fact that you had hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, the almost, I wouldn't call it infrastructure, but the civil support required, the soup kitchens, the clothes, the supplies. The government was in no position to organize that way. The only way to achieve that was for hundreds of groups to self-organize to enable those protests to happen. Now, given those personal testimonies, which I find compelling, how do you explain the fact that this CIA-backed coup narrative, which I do think Putin believes it to this day, why has that still got so much traction on the hard left and indeed the hard right in the US and the UK and across Europe?
It's a very good question, and honestly, it's a little baffling for me why this is such a conspiracy that just won't die. And given the overwhelming evidence against it, some of the main, pieces of evidence, supposed evidence that this conspiracy has on its side are really very, very superficial. Things like the Victoria Nuland having a conversation about who the next who will be in the Ukrainian government next. Well, the US was watching what is happening. Having this conversation in no way means that the US is directing the conversation. It's simply collecting information of what it looks like, where things are potentially going. They obviously had conversations with the government as well, not just with the opposition. They were concerned about instability in Ukraine, as they're concerned about instability in many other countries. I think the persistence of the conspiracy comes from the fact that certain segments of the left and the right in the US are just really overestimating the ability of the US to control things everywhere around the world. It's an inability to see that the US is not a kingmaker all over the world. A lot of things happen despite US efforts to influence events. So it's some sort of belief in the omnipotence of the US and of the CIA, and it also, I think, comes from the fact that it was a complicated situation. Not a lot of people have deep inside knowledge of Ukrainian politics that would allow them to understand that it is impossible to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people to protest over 2.5 months.
In the cold, in the winter.
Using a bunch of CIA agents. That really doesn't work. Also, lack of knowledge about the fact that Ukrainian civil society was on a trajectory towards self-organization, not only in 2014, but since the Orange Revolution. That precedent was very important. The fact that in 2005, they managed to organize a similar type of protest with a tent city, with soup kitchens, with people protesting around the clock, and that worked, that it did trigger a running of another round of this fraudulent election. That was a tremendously empowering moment for Ukrainian civil society. Ukrainian civil society understood that if they're organized well enough, if they have their logistics right, they can actually make a difference. And when 2013 happened, it started as a very small protest that was in response to Yanukovych backing down, sort of reneging on signing this association agreement with the EU. That was a small protest, but what made it really explode was that the police used force against the protesters, and that led to more and more people sort of thinking, well, civil society will not allow this regime to suppress protest. We have a right to protest, we will protest. And as a result, that really made the protest way, way, way bigger, and it kind of changed the dynamics of it. And you know, the regime simply miscalculated how they could respond to this. They miscalculated their response, and that led to their ultimate crumbling.
And it's an interesting feature of conspiratorial thinking, isn't it? On the one hand, the same people will berate the US for failing to put a plan in place in Iraq and installing, stable democratic government there, or even any kind of infrastructure, and bringing chaos in that country. And yet they will bestow on the US almost omnipotent powers to manipulate and control what is clearly a complex, chaotic, organic process, bottom-up process that's happening in Ukraine.
Exactly. It really is a full-blown overestimation of the capabilities of the US, but also I think it is a misunderstanding of the US's interests in Ukraine. I mean, there's reason to believe that the US is somehow a big fan of Ukrainian nationalists. Like, why would that be the case? The US is interested in stability in the region. It has always been, of course, we know from the way in which the Soviet Union disintegrated, that the US was very conservative. They were afraid of nationalist dynamics in the Soviet republics. They were not out to weaken Russia and to destabilize it. So there's no reason to believe that what the US wanted was a more nationalist, more Ukrainian Ukraine. What happened in 2014 was that there was a democratic opposition to a president that was becoming increasingly authoritarian. Which side would the U.S. Favor? Of course, it would favor the democratic opposition. It has nothing to do with weakening Russia. It had nothing to do with seeking a change of government. It was simply observing the situation and also trying to keep it stable for as long as possible. I mean, that's part of why there was discussion of who's going to be in the next government, making sure that it's going to be mainstream politicians and not fringe actors, which there was no danger of anyway. But that explains what the U.S. position there was, and it certainly was about helping a democratic movement succeed, and while also keeping things stable, as opposed to any goal of destabilizing or weakening Russia.
Mm. And of course, yes, the US was very slow to really recognize Ukrainian independence and agency, and was very concerned actually about that, until it happened. And it has to be remembered as well that Ukraine is not unique, but very few ex-Soviet states went through that kind of political evolution. Most reverted to much more autocratic modes of rule. And as a result, many of their economies have remained stagnant or moribund, really, over the last 30 years, or at least not achieved the kind of development that they could have done under another mode of government. I mean, the question I'd like to ask here really does relate back to Lukashenko, because, again, we see that in Belarus, there's a clear template of how Ukraine could go, and how that autocratic system of sham elections, fakes, and hybrid informational sort of terror and propaganda could take control of society, combined with extreme corruption and all the other features we know about. And I think a lot of people forget that at one point Lukashenko was actually quite I don't know whether this was really genuine or whether it was just a sort of puppet show, but he's extremely critical of Putin, and he also positioned himself as the protector of Belarusian independence from Russia. And Putin didn't seem to mind because it was an autocratic state next door. He probably thought that over time he would gain more leverage and influence, but he seems to be far less threatened by autocratic regimes. The same perhaps is true of Turkey. He's not making those threats against Turkey, which is a sort of hybrid autocracy as well, or going in that direction. He seems much more threatened by societies that are on an evolutionary path towards democracy.
Right. I mean, it is much easier for an autocrat to talk to and to negotiate with another autocrat. And Lukashenko over the years has tried to kind of play both sides, and the EU and Putin, and try to carve out some path for himself and for Belarus that's in the middle. Of course, he has had to make a lot of concessions to Putin. And right now, we could even say that Belarus has kind of given its sovereign ladder to Russia, as it is hosting and facilitating its war effort. And that's precisely sort of the goal that and the vision that Putin had for Ukraine, a country that will be available to Russia for to influence and to run as sort of a vassal state. And it is definitely the case that that the competitiveness of Ukraine's regime was a thorn on the side of Putin's Russia for a while. I mean, partly because he saw this as artificial competition run by the US, so to speak, but also partly because any competitive regime is sort of less predictable. You may end up, and that's what happened in Ukraine. You know, there was a revolving door of presidents. There were more pro-Russian presidents who would then lose elections to more pro-European presidents. And over time, I think what Putin realized was that even the pro-Russian presidents of Ukraine were not pro-Russian enough for his liking, because they had to contend with the realities of a competitive regime. They had to contend with the fact that there was a significant portion of society that was leaning pro-European, and they had to also accommodate their positions. So they couldn't take, even if they were elected on a pro-Russian ticket, they really could not go all in towards Russia, because they had to think about their re-election chances. And this is the way in which, over time, political competition moved Ukraine away from Russia and increasingly towards a pro-European path.
And of course, Ukrainian politicians existed within a media space that wasn't controlled in the way that Russian media is controlled. It's not to say there aren't, dissonant voices within Russia, but there's a kind of almost a puppet show, isn't there, where certain opposition opinions are allowed, some are tolerated, some are fully oppositional, but they're put in a kind of playpen where they can't do any damage, where they have no ability to have actions. Whereas in Ukraine, the evolution of the press is a far more dangerous and unpredictable element.
Absolutely. And that was the case, going back to the 90s. And that's where the divergence between Russia and Ukraine started, because Russia had a very competitive and diverse media space in the 90s. But gradually, Putin managed to impose a straitjacket and to sort of bring all the oligarchs who were usually behind the different media outlets, bring them all in line, and make it clear to them that if they don't actually pledge allegiance to the regime and to the state, their position as oligarchs can very quickly be taken away. What happened in Ukraine was that the Ukrainian state was never strong enough to do anything like that. So they gradually accepted that there will be competition of different oligarchic interests, but they also were different political interests representing not only oligarchic economic interests, but also constituencies within Ukrainian society. And the closest sort of that Ukraine was to autocratization was indeed under the 2 years of Yanukovych's regime in Yanukovych's presidency between 2010 and 2012, when we know that he tried to systematically dismantle some of the constraints on executive power. He had the Constitutional Court take a decision that reversed the parliamentary presidential switch that had happened at the end of the Orange Revolution. He tried to he did put his main political competitor, Yulia Tymoshenko, in prison on basically a politicized a lot of other politicians had to flee the country or were imprisoned as well. So this is the autocratization that Ukrainian civil society, emboldened by the Orange Revolution and by Yushchenko's very sort of decentralized presidency, weak presidency, when political competition was vibrant. Ukrainian civil society was taken aback by these autocratization steps. There was the Lukashenko example close by, the Russian example. This is not a road that Ukrainian civil society wanted to go down on. And that is why we saw the Euromaidan in the third year of Yanukovych's presidency. It wasn't just about this association agreement. It wasn't just about the beating up of protesters. It was a broader concern that this regime is heading on an authoritarian consolidation path, and it has to be stopped sooner rather than later, before it's too late.
And we've talked a lot about the progress that was made in civil society, resistance, and so on, the media, and even the plurality of political parties. A huge amount of progress is made. Slightly less progress, however, in the evolution of the judiciary and moving to more of an independent Western-style judicial system. And I know this is a key area that you've actually researched. So could you describe a little bit the problem and why the judicial system is such a tougher nut to crack than other parts of civil society?
So the problem with the Ukrainian judiciary over time has been that the judiciary was a rather weak institution in terms of the way in which judges saw their role in society. Basically, what you have is a professional role conception that emphasizes subordination to political power. And as a result, what happened over time was that even though there was a lot of political competition in the other branches, different presidents, competition in the legislature as well. Basically, what happened was that every new incumbent would quickly come up with a point man for the judiciary, and that point man for the judiciary would basically set the tone for what the judiciary would be doing. So that's a recipe for a judiciary that is politically subservient and is getting a lot of pressure from politicians to basically be used as a tool against political opponents. That's why when Tymoshenko went on trial, there was very little doubt that she would be convicted, because the idea was that if there was a way to stop her conviction, that way would have been civil society pressure, not a judge who is going to rule independently and say that the charges don't meet the threshold necessary for conviction. So I think 2014 is a significant watershed moment for the judiciary as well. And it's a significant watershed moment because it is during Euromaidan that civil society turns its attention to the courts and sees how crucial it actually is to have independent courts in order to have sustainable democratic competition. One crucial thing that was evident in Euromaidan was that the government can use the courts to suppress protest, can imprison protesters, harass them, get at their organization. I mean, the courts are an effective tool. And that drove home the point that reforming the judiciary is really, really crucial. So what we see from 2014 onwards is a lot of reform of the judiciary. These fundamental, significant reforms. There were a lot of laws were passed that completely changed the makeup of the judiciary, the way that it was institutionally set up. It brought the Ukrainian judiciary in line with best practices that were recommended by international institutions such as the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. So a lot was done on the institutional basis. Now, what we saw, though, in those 8 years is that it's one thing to change the institutional basis, but there is some time is needed for professional role conceptions to start catching up, for judges to actually realize that their goal in society is to uphold the law and to make sure that they inculcate impartiality and independence in the judges that are kind of coming from the lower ranks up the higher ranks. And it seems that that norm change is something that's tougher to do. But I think 2022 will be a watershed moment for the normative change as well, because now the institutional basis is there for an independent judiciary. And given how Ukrainian society has now realized that having a disciplined state is crucial to withstanding Russian aggression, having a state that's constrained in the sense that the funds are being spent as they should be. They're not being squandered through corruption channels. I think there is a lot of additional sort of realization of how crucial that is, which is going to drive the point home for the judiciary as well, that there will have to be a change in the way they see their role. And so I'm fairly optimistic that this will be a next stage for the development of an independent judiciary in Ukraine, which is where the norms are going to start catching up with the institutions.
And isn't it also that it must be a generational change, in that you can't necessarily take that older generation of people who brought up in the Soviet system and expect them to change their behaviors and perceptions? You almost have to have an entirely new generation of people educated in a different way and who have different experiences. Because I know, talking to Evgen Fedchenko, that this is how the journalistic practice in Ukraine was transformed. They literally pastured out, put out to pasture everybody brought up in the old system, and they just started afresh. Is that much more difficult to achieve in the judiciary?
Well, the generational change is important as well, but I think at this point, that has happened in the Ukrainian judiciary, because most of the judges that are now on the bench are people who came of age in the 90s and later. So it's not so much a communist legacy that has to be replaced, but it's the early post-communist legacy, the early years of competing oligarchic clans who controlled parts of the judiciary and were using it to compete with each other. It is that sort of legacy that needs to be overcome. And I think since 2014, a lot of progress has been made, partly as a result of the institutional changes, but partly as a result of the fact that there has been a whole sector of NGOs and civic organizations that focus on monitoring what the judiciary does and how it behaves, that push rule of law issues, that try to educate the public about how important the rule of law is and how important an independent judiciary is. I mean, Ukraine is rather unique in this regard, that rule of law issues are really highly salient with the public. I'll give you an illustration. Ukraine has a couple of shows where shows on TV shows, sort of like documentary style, investigative journalism kind of style shows that are devoted to the judiciary and to holding the judiciary accountable, to spreading the word about judges who are doing the right thing versus judges who are doing, the old style corrupt networks kind of shtick. So this is quite remarkable, that the level of education of the public on the issue of the importance of the rule of law is quite significant in Ukraine, and I think it will push things in the right direction over time.
And that was going to be my last question, really, was being a bit optimistic, assuming that Ukraine wins the current conflict, assuming that Russia's terroristic threats around dirty bombs, nuclear, etc., come to nothing. Let's look forward. And it seems like there's a lot of reasons for positivity. It seems like there's a lot of evolutionary changes happening in civic society, the judiciary, and so on. What do you think are the risks, and where might they have setbacks? Because, of course, they're going through an extraordinary period of change, extraordinary pressures, and a lot at the moment is probably being bottled up. What are the risks to progress in the post-war period?
I mean, I think one of the main risks is that there's going to be a lot of trauma in society as a result of the war. There's a lot of bottled up anger right now. And one of the main challenges after the war would be how to deal with portions of society that may have collaborated with the occupiers, how to make sure that this is dealt with in a procedurally sound way, in a way that is going to systematically rather than arbitrarily distinguish between collaborators and people who were really kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time and made a decision right there in the moment that had to do with their own safety and their family's safety. I think that will be a major risk, because if if the Ukrainian state kind of mismanages that part of the post-war reconstruction, it could be a recipe for some, civil rights violations. It may set back democratic progress a bit. I mean, it'll be a very hard road to navigate, but it's important to start thinking about it from now to make sure that it's done right.
And fuel for Russian propaganda as well, because we have to assume that whatever happens, the threat from Russia, the hybrid warfare is going to carry on, even if they lose on the battlefield. So they'll leverage any of those civic issues.
Exactly. And then I think the second risk is, given the perennial threat that Ukraine will have to face from Russia, there will be a very strong sort of impetus for Ukraine to militarize as a society in order to become fortress Ukraine, in order to protect itself. But that, of course, has also implications for domestic politics and for how you have a free and a free society that guarantees everybody's political and civil rights while also maintaining national security. I think they will have to also make sure that they get this balance right, and this will be a challenge and something, again, to start thinking about right now.
Well, Maria, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I think this topic, I share with Ukrainians a deep fascination for the judiciary and that evolution of civil society. I really appreciate you spending so much time to explain these, incredibly complex issues and making them, so easy to understand. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.